is there most weeks across our TV screens, in the newspaper headlines. Powerful typhoons, sweeping wildfires, rising sea levels, all contributing to the destruction of people's livelihoods worldwide. But as climate-related disasters continue to increase intensity, how do we deal with the fallout for the very people suffering the most? Good to have you with us. This is Roundtable. I'm David Foster. Well, last week the US President Donald Trump dismissed, as he often does, a study, this time by his own administration, on the potential catastrophic impact of climate change, simply saying, I don't believe in it. But the reality and the consequences of changing weather patterns wherever you happen to be are forcing many people away from their lands, from their homes, and the question is the world ready to help what we're now calling climate migrants?
The world we live in is changing. Disasters like typhoons and floods are becoming more frequent and powerful. Consecutive years of drought are costing farmers their crops and livestock, and low-lying islands and coastal areas are under threat by rising sea levels. But what happens to the people who live in these places, and where do they go if they're forced to flee? A report by the World Bank estimates 143 million could become climate migrants by 2050. Are we prepared for a population shift on a global scale?
Let's get talking. We go to Wales first of all. Joining us via Skype from Aberystwyth, we have Alex Randall from the Climate and Migration Coalition. Then to Geneva in Switzerland, Nina Birkeland, the Senior Advisor on Disasters and Climate Change at the Norwegian Refugee Council. With me here in the studio at the round table, Fiona Harvey, the Guardian Environment Correspondent. We welcome Fiona back, and Andrew Norton, Director of the International Institute for Environment and Development. Nina, let me come to you first of all. What do you think of when people talk about climate migration, climate migrants?
I think this is a very important issue to be both aware of, but also I think we have very much come to a point now where we know it's happening. We have figures like the one you had from World Bank. Ourselves, we've been trying to see how many people are displaced every year by sudden onset disasters, 25 million at least. So I think we know it's happening. It's big, but we now need to act. And I think just as we speak now, we are at a point where we have two important processes at the international level happening. We have the global, the negotiations around the Climatechange Convention taking place in Poland, opened yesterday. And in Marrakesh tomorrow, we'll open the Migration Week, where we'll have discussion around how to support and help people so they have less chance of being forced to migrate from climate change in the
Can I ask you about the Marrakesh conference in particular in a little while? But let me ask you one follow-up question to what we think of as climate migration. Who are the climate migrants? Do these people always have to remain away from what they have once called home, or do they return when the floods and the winds and the fires recede? Are they permanently without a home?
We don't know enough about it, but we know that many people flee and go away, and many people go back after not too long. But what we do see is that the number who not return quickly is relatively high. So we don't have accurate figures on it, but I think we can fairly say that at least half of those who flee are not returning quickly within a few months, but will stay displaced longer.
Each one of you may have an opinion on the next point I'm going to put, but I'll put it to Alex first of all, but you others please also jump in. We're talking about lack of food, we're talking about flooding, we're talking about fires, volcanoes, hurricanes, typhoons, whatever you call them. They are not new, Alex. So what's the new problem?
You're absolutely right that they're not new, but what we do know is that as the average global temperature warms because of climate change, because of the emissions that we've put into the atmosphere, it begins to alter the patterns of these disasters. So many of them become more severe or more frequent. So what we're seeing is that droughts last longer and therefore have more power to displace people, that hurricanes and typhoons can change where they're making landfall, they can be more severe, they can cause more destruction. And then with that additional destruction and with that additional frequency comes more displacement. So you're absolutely right that these are disasters that are familiar, and the kind of displacement that they create is also familiar. This is stuff we've seen on our TV screens for decades. The worrying thing is that because of the impact of climate change, because of the way that climate change alters these weather patterns and makes them worse, that we're going to see more of these disasters and with it, more displacement.
And we've also got, of course, Fiona, on this planet, many more people who might be affected by such events.
That's right. You know, as the population grows, more pressure is put on some of the areas that are likely to be worst hit. More pressure is put on the infrastructure as well. And we really don't have, at the moment, infrastructure around a lot of the world that is resilient to climate change. We don't have homes or buildings or transport networks or power networks that are actually properly adapted so that they can cope with these impacts.
Do you see any proper response to this? Because what was the number? 143 million by the year 2050.
Well, stuff is happening.
Something concerted going on?
Actually, just this morning, the World Bank announced $200 million $200 billion.
That's a drop in the ocean.
Dollars. That's a proper figure. $200 billion of climate change funding for the next 5 years, for 5 years from 2020 rather. And half of that will go towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but for the first time, equal weight will be given to adapting to the effects of climate change. And that means building resilience. It means things like early warning systems for extreme weather events, which can help people prepare and move out of the way. It means things like defences against floods. It means things like smart agriculture, so that people can cope with bigger extremes of weather than they're used to, with more heat or more rain. There's an awful lot of things that can be done. And in developed countries, quite often we do these things as a matter of course. You know, if people are in a flood-hit area in a developed country, they expect the government to come in and make their homes, their transport networks and so on more resilient. That doesn't happen in developing countries, and that's where this funding from the World Bank and from others needs to go.
You think it's real money? Because people often make promises when it comes to things like this, and they'll say, yeah, we're going to give you, each country, 10 billion, 20 billion, to make up a total of 200. It just never arrives.
Well, something that the World Bank has done as part of this $200 billion is to put in systems which will very clearly monitor where and how and when this money is actually spent. And what they're hoping as well is that this is just the beginning. They're hoping that if they lead the way, other development banks will follow, other governments will follow, and most of all that the private sector will follow. Because actually the private sector has a really huge interest in this. I mean, you can't have growing economies in developing countries if they're being hit by this extreme weather. It will have terrible economic impacts, and if companies want to safeguard their investments and safeguard their future, frankly, they need to.
So there's a personal interest in it as well. Talking about monitoring and prevention, etc., etc., I understand in New Zealand that they have got some kind of plan in place, perhaps one that's been put on hold, but it's being studied by the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand made an announcement, I think, about a year ago of a sort of rights-based scheme that would allow for resettlement from the Pacific Islands, but that's kind of been put slightly on hold. The Pacific Islands didn't, if you like, might have understandable worries about an announcement that kind of appears to presage their disappearance.
So they thought perhaps
sea level rise.
saw it as a form of colonisation,
No, maybe not. I think they welcomed the announcement, but felt that it wanted to be part of a joint thing between themselves and the New Zealanders.
But the idea would have been to do what?
The idea would have been to give a certain number of people displaced by effectively rising sea level, which is another of the drivers. We talked about rapid onset earlier. Rising sea level is also going to displace large numbers of people in various parts of the world, many more in Bangladesh than in the Pacific Islands. But the notion of this was that these island states, which are threatened by rising seas, that certain numbers of people would have the right to relocate to New Zealand. Like I say, that was kind of a groundbreaking announcement because it introduced a certain notion of rights. These are, the rights of the climate displaced. And I think it was very much welcomed. But like I say, it's on hold for the moment.
Let's talk about Bangladesh and Dhaka, and then compare it perhaps to what is possible in New Zealand or in Southeast Asia, because there you have a delta. Yeah, where sea levels are rising, there are less reasonable places in which people can build their homes. So they're having to move. They're having to go somewhere else. We're talking millions and millions of people. Now, India is not going to welcome them in the same way, perhaps, that New Zealand would have welcomed a small number of Pacific Islanders, because we're talking about two massively overcrowded places already.
I think the planning at the moment around sea level rise in the delta of Bangladesh is mostly looking at the possibility for those people to move to urban areas. And the concern is that the movement to urban areas within Bangladesh, that should be planned so that they can move to areas where they have a reasonable chance of a livelihood, you know, whether there's an inclusive and welcoming environment for them, and also a degree of climate resilience. There'll be a need to invest in the infrastructure, and also not all of them rocking up in Dhaka as well, but planning for secondary towns and smaller towns.
I do love it at this point in the programme, when we've all had a chance to say something, that you can actually sort of take over the conversation without me asking any questions or any stupid questions. So feel free at any point to say what you think. Now, I'm going to put this one to all of you at the same time. We have a massive rise in population numbers worldwide. We have climate change, and a gentleman called Malthus many years ago might have said, well, look, you know, that's what's causing it. You've got too many people. Let's have a flood, let's have a famine, let's have a volcanic eruption to level out the population. So it's basically tough luck. Just get on with it. Alex.
Well, I mean, Malthus is largely discredited. He was a kind of Victorian pseudo-scientist, really. So I think the idea that we would be basing anything on Malthus's projections or his ideas is fairly dubious. I would say something about population, though, which is that largely the problems that we're seeing resulting from climate change are not really just about the number of people, but the amount that certain people consume and the amount that, as a result, they emit in terms of carbon dioxide. Now, what's happening there is it is not the countries with the large and growing populations that are doing most of the emitting and causing most of the damage. It's actually a very small number of people in the wealthier countries, the world's wealthiest countries, that are actually putting that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that is causing these problems. Okay, so the problem is not
can I counter that by saying that there are two major developing countries, China and India, who have basically said, look, you've done it for years, we're going to do it just the same, and they are huge populations, and they're accelerating the process as well. So it's not just developed countries.
Well, no, largely it is.
Not just, I said.
The per capita emissions of the richest countries are far and away higher than the per capita emissions of the poorer countries and some of the rapidly growing economies like India and China. So this is still really an issue about consumption and wealth rather than an issue about overall numbers of people. Is it possible, Alex, sorry to butt in again, is it possible that we, rather than the effects of climate change, we could get on to perhaps the effects of climate migration, which is really what this one is about? And I noticed that you made a point that it's people in rural areas who are going to be probably worst affected. And we'll get on to what would happen if these things reach the cities in just a moment, but rural areas first. Yeah, okay, so I think one of the huge drivers of climate-linked migration that we're going to see first, in fact, one that we're seeing already, is the impacts of drought eroding people's livelihoods. And what happens here is that if you live in a farming area, as drought begins to make farming less profitable, begins to make it harder, as your yields fall, people begin to think, where else can I find a job if the farm is no longer supporting me? And for millions of people, the answer to that question is in a nearby city. Okay, so the initial part of climate-linked migration that we're talking about is not going to be vast numbers of people all moving at once, all crossing an international border, all kind of going from one country to another. But it's actually going to be people moving in ones and twos from rural areas as a result of drought into cities. Now, that doesn't mean that the impact of this isn't dramatic, because that means that the numbers of people in those cities are going to be increasing, and it means that there are going to be big questions for cities how they deal with that, how they provide for those people.
So can we ask Nina this one? And I don't know whether this is your particular area of expertise. Any one of you can say it. If we have a population exodus from the countryside to the cities for various reasons. A, the countryside is no longer habitable. Secondly, they need to be able to make a living and get food. What happens if the climate change, the flooding, the winds, the hurricanes come to the cities rather than in less remotely populated areas?
I think what we will see happening is that in very many cities, people will have bigger problems because it's so many people in a small area. So if a city isn't climate change adapted, so making constructions, making infrastructure in such a way that it can adapt with the effect of climate change, people will be more severely hit. But I think also what we look at is today, most people already live in cities. So it's not just moving from countryside to cities, but really how do we, as Fiona Wilson said, how do we use what we know, how do we do resilience work to be ready for this?
Can I just come
Please
in
do.
with a thought as well on the climate finance issue that Fiona was talking about earlier? The announcement from the World Bank's very welcome in terms of increasing the volumes and also in terms of the language around reaching poor countries and reaching the poorest people. But there is still the how as well as the how much. There is a need for us to find ways of delivering more of that money to the front line, to where people are really suffering the impact.
And do you believe that's in remote areas at the moment?
It's both in remote areas and it's in cities, but in cities it would tend to be in informal settlements, which don't have good infrastructure, typically don't have much investment.
Shantytown
Yeah,
Yeah.
which don't have like the flood defences and the infrastructure that the commercial centres and the middle class areas have.
Try and expand this slightly. Because this is something I think, Alex, that you mentioned at a conference recently. Mass displacement of people like this leads to conflict. Yeah. And the reasons for that mass displacement are perhaps climate driven. But the end result is that people come into conflict with one another, and we see world wars, we see civil wars, we see there's a huge knock-on effect.
Right. I think one of the things
Syria being an example.
Right. I think one of the things that we need to be mindful of here is to recognise that there are potential ways in which climate change and its impact can drive armed conflict. That is certainly true, and there are some very worrying studies which point to these connections, especially in places that are already prone to armed conflict. So in locations where there is a history of armed violence, in places where government is unstable, also in places where there is very stark inequality, very stark differences between the richest and the poorest, seem to be places that are particularly prone to these kinds of conflict. And as we see climate change exacerbating some of those inequalities, pushing people further into poverty, what we see is places that are perhaps already on the edge of conflict, being tipped into new episodes of armed violence. However, what I should say is that this is a pattern which exists in places that have underlying other reasons why conflict might be going on there. We're not talking about kind of a sudden eruption of violence in an otherwise completely peaceful and completely stable location.
Yes, there
so
are
in a way, this is
a whole variety of factors that cause this, but the real problem is that Fiona, that it happens.
Yeah, I mean,
and will it happen increasingly, I guess?
It's incredibly hard to pin migration solely on climate change and to pin conflict solely on climate change. There's a variety of factors at play. What we can say safely is that climate change exacerbates existing difficult situations, food shortages, a lack of availability of things like water and fertile land, forests and so on, that people need. And as climate change exacerbates those things, then we are likely to see worsening conflict in the same way that we see sort of more extreme weather. But it is incredibly hard to draw out these different strands, and that's part of the problem here, because governments tend not to respond very well when you say, you know, this is a terribly complex issue and there are many factors at play. Governments tend to respond better when you say there's one thing and one thing you need to do.
Bring me solutions, don't bring me problems.
Exactly.
And one of the problems, Nina, is that people who are forced to flee their homes because of climate change are not classed, and we say forced, are not classed as refugees. Why on earth not?
I think that they're not classed as that is something we should keep, because the Refugee Convention is very clearly covering people who flee from conflict and violence, and climate change is not part of that convention. We know that...
Well, it's natural violence, it's just not man-made, although you could argue it was man-made, but it is a natural violence, isn't it?
It is a violence from the environment, and yes, most of this is actually man-made because it's a human-driven climate change. But I think in the Refugee Convention, the key terminology there is persecution, and we can't put that on climate change. I also think if we were to open up for a new convention to include the people crossing borders because of climate change in the same kind of set as refugees, this is something that will take very, very long to happen. It will not happen when I'm alive. I'm sure it will take many more decades. Maybe my grandchildren will see something.
Yeah.
And as we heard already, this is happening now, so we need something to happen now and not wait for an ideal convention.
In the absence of time and in the absence of a willingness perhaps to change their status, what should we do with these people?
I think what we should do is to make sure that in everything we work on, that is development, financial issues, we include the thought of people being displaced by effects of climate change. And the other thing is that there's actually a lot going on national and regional level. So how do we use that and learn from that and not just wait for a perfect international convention? There's something called the Platform on Disaster Displacement, where states have come together to show how effective practices can help both to prevent and support it when it happens. For example, Central America has been very proactive in this regard, and they have had exercises between countries where they practice what will they do when people cross the border. So in this way, deal with the reality and not wait for something ideal that won't happen.
Earlier on in the programme, I can't remember who it was, but we referenced the meeting in Poland. We referenced the meeting taking place, I think, the next couple of days, in Marrakesh. Now, who's going to get together to say that something needs to be done here, and what do you think would be the most important thing to come out of, let's say, the Marrakesh meeting?
The Marrakesh meeting will adopt the Global Compact on Migration, which is a kind of voluntary framework, a cooperative framework between countries. It's not a treaty. The content is good, but we know that certain countries will stand outside it broadly.
United States being one?
United States, Australia, Italy, crudely you could say, countries with these populist kind of tending regimes are very unlikely to sign up to it. So it's great that some countries are supportive.
And what will be the most immediate effect of this adoption of this policy?
I think the most immediate effect is to establish a broadly humane set of principles for dealing with issues of migration in general, not just climate migration.
We often think these things are happening to other people, don't we? And yet you mentioned to me before we came on air that there is an important step being taken about what's going to happen in Europe.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that we see with extreme weather is that, of course, extreme weather can happen anywhere. One of the things we see with sea level rises is that sea levels rise around the globe, and many of the world's biggest cities are built next to the sea. London, we found out last week, a report from the Met Office found out that sea levels in London could rise by as much as more than a metre, 1.15 metres by the end of the century. And that's a lot, and that's something that would cause a great deal of damage throughout London. So work is going on now to try and mitigate that, to try and...
have to move London like they're trying to move a city in Louisiana.
They are trying to move in Louisiana, and they're trying to move cities in our towns and so on in the Arctic, and in other places people are just sort of moving naturally away from the worst hit areas. But the problem is you can't really move forever. And if you look at things like, I mean, you know, take even New York. We had Hurricane Sandy in New York. That's one of the wealthiest cities in the world, and even it is not immune. What happens when you get another Hurricane Sandy? What happens when you get a Hurricane Sandy every year? And those are the kind of effects that we're looking at with climate change. So nowhere escapes. Although the poor will be worst hit because they have the least resilience, they are least able to cope with these effects. There is no escaping climate change for the rich world either.
So perhaps one day we will all have to move to higher ground, or we're coming to the end of the programme, move to higher ground like Noah did at Mount Ararat, until eventually we're just sort of left with 2 or 3 people stuck on the top there, and it's not us that get taken away, it's just the animals who've done nothing to cause all of this. Listen, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this programme. Fiona, good to see you again. And thank you very much indeed. Andrew, Nina and Alex, thank you for watching. I'm David Foster, but from me and the Roundtable team, there will be another time. We hope to have you then. Bye for now.